I'm Deborah DeBoer, and I am delighted to bring to you this month's EDUcast. My guest is Dino Robinson, who is the founder of the Shorefront Legacy Program. This morning, we're going to be discussing what they do there and why it's important what they do there. So without further ado, let me introduce Dino to you. Dino, it's lovely to have you as a guest today. I've been thinking about all the questions that I wanted to ask you because you and I have never had a chance to meet before. It's Mary Rosinski, who's running for alderwoman, I believe, in Evanston. I think that's what they call them, as alderwomen. But she suggested that I talk to you. So you must be fairly good friends with Mary. You must know Mary a little bit.
I think a lot more people know me than I know them.
Well, that's always scary when people say, oh, I know you, and you're thinking, I don't know who you are. I've had that experience. Anyway, what I did do is a little bit reading up on you, and you've had kind of a really interesting path that you've traveled in Evanston. I understand that you came into Evanston about 1980, which seems just like recent history to me, but really is no longer just recent history. But you've been on a journey. Can you tell us a little bit about the organizations you've worked with, why you started the organization that you are working with now? Talk a little bit about some of those things.
Sure. As you stated, I came here with my family in 1980. I was entering 8th grade at Nichols, coming from Glenview, Illinois, where I did my elementary school classes there, and I integrated my school. So I came from an interesting background where I came from Glenview, well, originally from Chicago, moved to Glenview to Evanston in 8th grade when I was entering 8th grade. And I've always had this interest in history, but I knew I did not want to be a teacher. I also had an interest in graphic design. So I had these two paths that I was pursuing in high school. Anything that dealt with graphics or mechanical drawing, photography, as well as history, and ended up being in history honors courses, and was interested in family history. And one of my early influences was my grandmother in South Carolina, who introduced me to our own family history of work that she did prior to her passing. And that influenced me a lot about who I am, and what I can become. She was able to put context to my family history, going back as early as what we've traveled so far as 1795. So it's a long history. When I got out of college, I did pursue graphic design. I was an art director for some time in Chicago. And then I left and started my own business in Evanston. And during that time, one of the first nonprofits I worked for or did some work with was the Organization of Black Designers. It's still in existence now. It's called Osmosis, and they operate on the South Side, but they influence and help guide youth pursuing careers in advertising, design, fashion, photography, architecture. That's what that organization does. But that kind of got me really interested in what it's like to be involved in nonprofits. So locally here in Evanston, I ended up getting involved in several nonprofits, one of them being the Evanston History Center, the Noise Cultural Arts Center, Black History Month celebration, the Public Art Committee, the Arts Council, the Chamber of Commerce, and I know I'm forgetting some other ones too. One of them was Evanston Neighborhood Conference. I was the president of that organization before it folded. But so a number of things that kind of taught me how to engage in the community and think about a greater context of how it is to serve in the community. But during my time, and I go back to Osmosis, an organization of Black designers, it was right around the time I started looking at local history. And out of a challenge of a local newspaper at the time called the Evanston Clarion, the editor challenged me to write some articles about local Black history. And I figured that, this surely had to have been done already. And surely there are groups out there that are doing this already. And, there were in the community, there are some, small pockets of residents that were doing history, but they're really focused on their own family lineage, but working as a group. But there's nothing like, bringing all of the stories together of local Black history. So I went to the Evanston Public Library and the local historical organizations to look at what they were doing and realized not a lot was being done. So with the knowledge I learned from helping to start up the Organizational Black Designers Chicago chapter, I used at that same time, I established Shorefront as a nonprofit to do work toward documenting local history. And during that time too, and using my new knowledge of learning how to connect with people, I started finding residents that were very interested in local history, and they became my core group of people to pursue what eventually became Shorefront. And Shorefront's an organization that documents the African American community in Chicago's suburban North Shore.
As I listened to you talk, one of the things that struck me is the relationship you had with your grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's so interesting in anyone's history, if you can find the time to hear what grandma and grandpa have to say and to hear their stories and all that. So much of what for them is just oral history. I mean, that's really what it is. It's oral history is being lost, because when they pass away, that's gone. So the fact that you recaptured some of your grandmother's stuff, that you did some studies with that, are you doing that with other people as well? Are you capturing like oral histories from people?
Yes. When I started Shorefront and that really started taking off, I was trying to figure out what we could do that has some type of, give back to the community. Um, the first thought was, let's write a comprehensive history book. And the more I looked at it, I said, well, we don't have enough information to even do anything comprehensive. We're still in discovery mode. And it's funny because 25 years later, we're still in discovery mode because there's so much that's missing. So what I started doing was interviewing people that lived in the community, recording them, audio tapes, digital media, whatever I could utilize at that time. So mine was like mid 1990s, and started seeing a pattern of stories. And in the first few years of doing oral histories, we recorded nearly 50 families. And we had a system for that. We had a core group of questions that we would always ask everyone, and then from there it would just branch off to any specifics that that family had that was interesting. But all of them always started like, who were your parents were, why did your parents come here, or why did you come here, what was your earliest memory of growing up in Evanston and the North Shore, what were some of the issues at the time, what were you involved in, what high school did you go to, what college did you go to. Just kind of went on through their living resume, so to speak. Then we will just like freelance from there, because depending on what they got involved in, I would ask or dig deeper into those storylines. But each of these interviews were approximately an hour long. My record was 8 straight hours with one person.
An interesting soul you must have, or a chatty one.
Yeah, it was very chat. She had a wonderful memory at the time, and she started painting a picture block by block who was living at each house down
Oh,
Simpson
how
Street.
cool.
And I thought that was just fascinating. And I had to stop after 8 because I ran out of tapes.
Mm.
Sorry, you can keep talking, but I don't have anything left. I have no media left to record you on. And I was surprised that I spent all day with her. I mean, she made me something to eat, but she kept talking, and it was just on. And she reminded me a lot of my grandmother at the time too, when she was talking to me. So it was really just engaging. And I always wanted all the interviews to have that same feeling of engagement, where I'm not just asking a cold question and and they would answer, and then I would cut off and ask the next question. I would try and pose the questions to become conversations.
You mentioned when you were speaking just now that there were themes that came out.
Mm-hmm.
What were some of the themes that came out?
So the common themes that came out always indicated spaces. So the Emerson Street YMCA was a theme that came out. There was a segregated Y in Evanston. Community Hospital, which is a segregated hospital. Foster School, which was a de facto segregated school because of the neighborhood makeup. But also comments like, I would ask if there were any, like, I wouldn't like pose it like, was there any racism in Evanston? I would say, what were some of the issues growing up in Evanston? And so it was more wide open, but almost everyone indicated that racial relations was an issue. Some families would comment saying that it was understood that we don't go downtown Evanston. It was understood we don't cross the border into Skokie. It was understood we don't go to the Grove Street YMCA. It was understood that we were not allowed to go to the high school prom. So we made our own community, and this is what we did in our community. We organized this, we developed this, we started clubs, we have our own nightlife scene that we had created ourselves. We started our own businesses, in our basements, in our homes. So all these stories were really coming out. And the more I learned about the community, especially some of the key things like learning people's nicknames, um, you get this different storyline. So if they didn't know who I was, if I asked a question, they would just give me the answer. But if I knew more about their life growing up, they almost treated me as I was a peer, and we're just having a conversation that we grew up together. And so the stories get deeper and more enriched.
I am a South Side girl, grew up in Brighton Park. And one of the things I've been doing lately is, and then moved to the suburbs, out to the southwestern suburbs for high school. One of the things we've just done is an at home with diversity class. And one of the things we talk about are the things that live in your head that you don't even know live in your head. And I think so many of these things live in your head when you don't even know they're getting put in there. For example, don't cross the street, don't go here, don't go there, this sort of thing. And so I think part of the struggle that people are having these days is to sort of wash those crummy things that are living in their heads out of their heads, or at least bring them to the fore of things that they didn't even realize they had living in their. They call it, the National Association is doing a thing called a video called implicit bias.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about it as the garbage that lives in your head that you don't even realize is living there. And I'm betting that with race relations and that, some of that has been certainly from my side. We're different colors. You and I don't know if you've noticed this, but you and I are different colors.
I didn't notice at first.
But the truth of the matter is, I've got garbage living in my head. But I did an interview with someone from John Marshall, and she said, "But I have garbage living in my head too. Different. Our garbage is different, but it's living there." So, are you finding some of that as you do the interviews, that there's like garbage that we all just need to get rid of?
Yeah, but I would paraphrase this. There's some garbage that's in there that's been ingrained and enforced. And I think we see a lot of that today with the reaction of what's happening in this country right now. I mean, the reason why Black Lives Matter, for example, exists because of the garbage that lives, like you said, the garbage that lives in everybody's head, these concepts of what people think someone should be doing. So there's a cause and effect. And let's say, for example, the garbage that lives in my head, I have to, implement those sometimes, basically to preserve my life. So I don't have that necessarily freedom to live with that garbage and not feel affected in a way that could affect my life as others could. When I leave the house, unconsciously, I'm thinking about, if I walk out the house and the police sees me, what are they going to think? If I'm walking down the street and I see a white couple walking toward me, what are they thinking? They have a dog. What is that dog trained to do? So those are the things that live in my head. And I have to keep those in my head because history has taught me that there is some harm that can come to me if I don't pay attention to that.
How do I change? How does that change? How is what you're doing going to make a change in that? Because I'm guessing that's partly why you're doing what you're doing, is to help affect change. How does recognizing that make me the woman in the couple that's walking towards you with my dog? What needs to change in my head?
Well, there's so many things, there's so many layers to that. There's, when we talk about, let's say racism, and the term institutionalized racism, this is exactly what, we have to try and figure that out. Things have been so ingrained and institutionalized that it became normalized. So that entire structure in many ways has to be dismantled, and that's going to be difficult. Because when you're used to something and people are used to a certain way, when that is being disrupted, there's going to be a hard pushback against that. And if we can't overcome that pushback and advance from that, then we're not going anywhere. So the steps that we take, I mean, you can see this kind of playing out right now in the country. I mean, let's take, for example, Second Amendment. The minute somebody thinks that you're challenging the constitutionality of the Second Amendment, you have people just losing their minds about what that means. Oh my God, you're gonna come and take my guns away, and we're gonna live in this police state where we can't do anything and defend ourselves. And in reality, we're like, we are living amongst people, and we're trying to protect people, and that is lost with this sense of this is my right to have this, but for others it's not your right to challenge that, even though the law explicitly states something very specific. Yes, you can, but it's got to be regulated in a very strong way. And people forgetting that second part of the Second Amendment, that the regulation is all part of it. So bringing this back to society, I mean, we have to change our thought process where thinking that this implicit bias is somehow inhibiting us or taking away our privileges. It's not. It's just growing the privileges for everyone, where everybody benefits from.
I had lunch with an old friend of mine, and over our conversation, we were talking about it, and we're two old ladies, so I'm just going to tell you that's kind of our conversation. But I said, we've lost the will to consider the greater good. To consider the greater good. It's what's good for me. You worry about what's good for you, but what we're not going to worry about is what's good for everybody.
Yeah, that is lost.
And that I think some communities still have that here and there. But I think that's what we're seeing a lot, is the idea that there's enough of pie, there's just plainly enough pie, for everybody to have a piece. And let's figure out what, if you can't have eggs in your recipe, well, we'll keep the eggs out because no big deal, kind of thing. That's a crazy analogy, but we'll go work toward the greater good as opposed to the individual good. And I think that's a challenge that we're all going to have to work toward, I think.
Right. We lost all that. I mean, I think we're so individualized with how we're supposed to approach everything, and we're trained to do that from the beginning. How do we get our kids in the best school possible? How do we find a home in the best neighborhood possible for me? I had a colleague at one point that she was white, and she claimed to be like this universal, like I love everyone, and my sibling is biracial, and I'm altruistic. But then she'll make comments like, I want to make sure I live in this neighborhood that will benefit me and my child to go to the best school possible that other people can't get into. And I saw that dynamic pretty interesting, and I had to look at her and say, did you just hear what you just said? Did you really truly listen to what you said? On one hand, you're saying you're this, but then you do the exact opposite. So are you really who you say that you want to be when you're not being that? Where all communities can have the same access to resources, but you're already vying for yourself to be in the best resource possible, and pretty much damn everybody else.
Yeah, that's, I think, one of the big challenges that we're having is everybody's worried about my stuff and not worrying about our stuff. That's really one of the big things. One of the things that I've read in the last year that was most interesting, and because you are a historian, was the New York Times 1619 project. It was fascinating reading for a girl who went to school in grammar school in the 1960s and didn't have there was nothing that I learned in history, in grammar school or high school, and certainly not even in college, that I learned anything about that. How important is that?
That's the biggest thing that's missing in our educational system. I think, from what I see and what scholars talk about, is how public education has been, I guess, systemized in a way to tell a very specific story from a very specific point of view. Even if you have to kind of elaborate on it. And what you just stated, many other people have stated the same way too when I was introducing local history. The common feedback was, I did not know. And and people start questioning their education. It's like, well, what did I miss in school? What was I really taught in school? Was it the truth? You know, how I have to relook at my history books again to see how things were told. I mean, I remember when I was young, I did look at my history book differently. As I stated earlier, I lived in Glenview for a while, and I was the only Black kid in the school. And I'm looking through the history book, and I swear to you, I remember plainly that there was one section about slavery. It was exactly one paragraph long out of the entire history book. Blacks were enslaved, and then later on in the book, kings freed us. That was pretty much the lesson. And
And I would
then when
say
you
that
have
was
that, and
probably
then
my lesson
right.
too.
And then everything else about that was the celebration of great America, how the expansion of the West, you know, grew the territory and the Industrial Revolution. So all these like feel good things about how we grew. I started looking at the history book titles and chapter titles differently. So when it came to the expansion of the West, I said, okay, it's the slaughter of the Native American Indian and the acquisition of land through war. The Industrial Revolution. Okay, it was child labor and how we abused the human body to work long hours in unsafe conditions. So that was my mind thinking in grammar school about these history titles. And I knew there was a lot more, but the school was not equipped to teach me that. But I had that in my mind. I knew I'm missing a big chunk, but I just had to go along with the program.
I had no idea I was missing a big chunk. I mean, that's the sad thing for me. I had no idea that I was missing a big chunk. I got smarter as I got older, but there was a long time that I missed all of those kinds of things. All of those kinds of things.
There's some people that even get into college and still miss it all, and they want to go back and say, "Well, I want my, you know, I want my money back from my history classes because this is not what I was taught."
Yeah, I know more about British history than I do about American history, certainly from when I was in. I know, isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
I know more about British history than I do about American history in some ways. One of the things in Evanston, you got a whole ton of really interesting things happening in Evanston these days. And you've made headlines. You've made headlines across the country because you're the first people who are doing reparations. And I don't really want to get deep into that because I know that there are people there are a lot of floating around, a lot of different feelings floating around with that. But if you had to give, are you pleased with the direction Evanston is taking? Not pleased? And I don't want it, you know, I don't want the nitty gritty, but does this seem like a step in the right direction to you?
I think my overall view of this is that what this is starting to do is put into practice the whole concept of reparations. What's been happening across the country in dialogue with reparation is just that. It's just dialogue. It's a concept. It's a theory. It's a way of doing something, but nothing tangible has been done toward that. And so what I'm proud of what Evanston is doing is putting their foot forward with a pool of money to develop programs around that, to see what works, what doesn't work, how it develops on a macro. I mean, on the micro. Because the macro is going to be much harder if we can't do this on a local level. If you cannot address some issues at a local level that are specific to a local thing, then what's going to happen with a national model? It's going to be even more multi-layered, more complex, that has to be dealt with. And we're starting to see these issues coming up now on the micro. And it's important to address that and keep building on it so it can be the most beneficial type of effort before it goes to a national model. I know there are many definitions of what people feel are reparations and what's due and how to approach it, but without actually implementing something, then all of it is just talking theory.
There's a lot of talking theory going around. As my last question to you, you have this organization that you have. Tell me how people can best use your organization.
So multiple ways, and it's a push-pull type of thing, or it's a mutual beneficial giving type of organization. So in order to have history and archives, you have to have relationships with families and institutions. We cannot pull this history out of thin air. The history is living amongst us, living around us. Families and institutions have this in their mind and their homes. So what helps Shorefront grow is to continue to acquire artifacts and information about the local history. In turn, what we do is that we process that as fast as possible and make that available for the community to utilize for their various projects or just for information. So students can come in and do research. So initiatives like reparations, city officials and aldermen can come in and utilize the materials there for firsthand material to support their work. For educators to utilize the information that we have and maybe create curriculum to teach teach students, or families to come in and see their own legacies captured in a facility in perpetuity. So that's the public aspect of that. Now, saying all of that, it takes a lot of man hours to do that, a lot of people hours to do that. Um, sometimes, people, some of the things that make me laugh or smile are, well, why don't you just write a grant to do this? And I always say, well, if it was that easy to write grants and win grants, everybody would have a nonprofit and everybody would be making lots of money. But here's the reality of it. And I'll use this one grant process that we did apply for. It was a humanities grant. It was a national humanities grant. The total pool of money that was available was $18,000. And they're offering these small micro grants between $1,000 and $2,000 to get storage material for your archives. But you had to do all this work ahead of time. You had to get it certified. You had to process it. You had to tier it. What's more important? What's at risk? All these things. Have these other studies done. And we had a lot of that done. But in the end, we did not win that grant after all that work in applying for it. So, and it wasn't that our grant was bad. It's that there were 256 grant applicants for that small pool of money. So in the end, only about 16 to 18 organizations got the grant out of 256 applications. So it's highly competitive. And our grant score, and they're scored, on the percentage. And so probably the winners got 100%. I might have had 98%. But because I missed that, and there's another grant that we did win, I was only 100%. Everybody else was like 97%, 96%. But they didn't get the grant because there was only like a few slots that were open. So it takes money and manpower to process the archives, to digitize the archives, to figure out storage, to create finding aids. So it's a lot of homework that needs to be done with that. So donations to Shorefront in a financial way is helpful. We started an endowment at the Emerson Community Foundation so we can fund that and use proceeds from that fund to fund our activities at Shorefront, for example. So we're looking at long-term growth for Shorefront because we want to be here for the next 100 years, 200 years, so that families and organizations can come back and utilize the findings that we have. And right now we have over 350 linear feet of archival materials for people to use.
Okay. Do you need volunteers too?
Always. And fortunately, we do get some really good interns from Dominican University and now Northwestern University and some others from around the country. We've had students that, who live in the area who are going to school elsewhere in the country, but arranged to have an internship program over the summer at Shorefront to process archives or do oral history interviews or assist with an exhibit. We have a lot of stuff to do. And it's a lot of hands-on stuff. So, and what's great about us is that if somebody's processing an archive, chances are you're going to get to meet the people that donated that archive to the collection. So if you have questions, I'm like, you don't have to ask me. Let's call the family. We'll bring them in.
Yeah. Dino, it has been a pleasure to have you on camera this morning. It's just been I don't think I ever met a historian before, to tell you the truth, a real life historian before. So from that point of view alone, it was. But also the work you're doing, I think, is critically important, and it's critically important. So I thank you, and NSBAR thank you, and all our members thank you for joining us this morning.
Well, thank you for having me.
And that's a wrap. April has been designated by the the National Association of Realtors as Fair Housing Month. You can watch on all the ways that we communicate with our members for lots of information about everything that has to do with fair housing. Watch Facebook, watch our newsletter, and always you can come to our website as well and see what we're doing on the website. I want to thank you again all for being with us and look forward to seeing you again next month.